Welcome back to Biographics. I'm your host for this episode, cosmic horror author Eric Malachite, and today's video script was provided by Radu Alexander, so be sure to show him some love in the comments while you deploy your likes, subscribe to the channel if you're not, and share this video with someone who loves learning about historical figures and events. Let's get to it. Renovatio Imperii Romanorum, or Renewal of the Empire of the Romans, a theme that remained popular throughout the late antiquity and Middle Ages that promoted the idea of bringing back the old glory days of Rome and restoring the empire to the mighty juggernaut that it once was. Given the massive influence that Rome had on the history of the world, it is understandable why this was such an alluring position. Surely, whoever would pull off such an amazing feat would immortalize himself as one of the greatest Roman leaders in history, placing himself on equal footing with names such as Augustus, Trajan, Marcus Aurelius, and Hadrian. But this was a lot easier said than done. Anyone who wanted to attempt the restoration of Rome had a gargantuan undertaking ahead of them. For starters, as the empire as it stood then was a shell of its former self, in terms of size, wealth, and power. The western half had collapsed completely, while the eastern half is now better known as the Byzantine Empire. Germanic kingdoms arose where the Western Roman Empire once stood, and they would all have to be conquered one by one. And there were still other enemies to take into account, like the Sasanians, who had a vested interest in making sure that Byzantium didn't get too big for its britches. It seemed like an impossible task, but one man decided to give it the old college try, and that man was Justinian. Justinian was born circa 482 AD in Teresium, a town in Illyria near Skopje, the modern capital of North Macedonia. His birth name was Petrus Sabatius, although he later adopted the more royal-sounding name of Flavius Justinianus, or simply Justinian to you and me. His parents, Sabatius and Vigilantia, were poor peasants, but fortunately for young Justinian, his uncle was not. In fact, his uncle Justin started out as a peasant as well, but he made his way to Constantinople, where he joined the Exubitors, the new imperial guard founded a few decades earlier by Emperor Leo I. Just like with the Praetorians centuries earlier, serving as the emperor's bodyguard was a prestigious position, one that resulted in higher offices for those who distinguished themselves. So Justin rose through the ranks until he was appointed the Comes Excubitorum, the commander of the imperial guard, under Emperor Anastasius I. And as it happened, Justin liked his new nephew very much, so he sent for the boy to come to Constantinople to receive a good education. With his uncle's help, Justinian embarked on a promising military career, and in 518 AD, things got even better. Emperor Anastasius died childless. A brief succession struggle ensued, but this was nothing that couldn't be solved with a few political assassinations. With the support of the Imperial Guard, Justin emerged triumphant and became the new ruler of the Byzantine Empire. Justin himself also had no children, and he was getting on in years, and he was almost 70 when he took the throne. Knowing he wasn't going to reign for long, he adopted Justinian and named him his heir. All of a sudden, the poor boy from a poor family was the future emperor of Byzantium. Unsurprisingly, Justinian's power grew steadily while his uncle ruled. First, he was named consul. Then, in 525 AD, he was given the title Caesar, which was basically a junior emperor. And finally, in April 527, he was named Augustus, co-emperor alongside his uncle. A few months later, Justin passed away, and Justinian became sole ruler of the Byzantine Empire. Before we get into the nitty-gritty of Justinian's reign, we would be remiss if we didn't mention his scandalous marriage to Theodora, the lowly courtesan who became Empress of Byzantium. There are multiple accounts about her, but by far the most detailed and most obscene belongs to the 6th century historian Procopius, in his controversial work, The Secret History. On the plus side, Procopius was not only a contemporary of Justinian, but actually traveled on many of his military campaigns. You rarely got that kind of first-hand account back in those days, but on the other hand, by the end of his life, Procopius grew to hate Justinian's guts. His secret history, which wasn't published during his lifetime, never missed an opportunity to dunk on the emperor, and one of the historian's go-to insults was to lambaste Justinian for falling for a vulgar woman such as Theodora. Here is a selection of how Procopius described the Empress. And she did not wait to be asked by anyone she met, but on the contrary, with inviting jests and a comical flaunting of her skirts herself, tempted all men who passed by, especially those who were adolescent. On the field of pleasure, she was never defeated. Often she would go picnicking with 10 young men or more, in the flower of their strength and virility, and dallied with them all the whole night through. When they were wearied of the sport, she would approach their servants, perhaps 30 in number, and fight a duel with each of these, and even thus found no allayment of her craving. Thus, those who were intimate with her were straightway recognized from the very fact to be perverts, and any more respectable man who chanced upon her in the forum avoided her and withdrew in haste, lest the hem of his mantle, touching such a creature, might be thought to share in her pollution. Thus was this woman born and bred, and her name was a byword beyond that of other common wenches on the tongues of all men. And there's a lot more where that came from. So yeah, Procopius definitely wasn't a fan. Most accounts mention that Theodora was once an actress and courtesan, so those parts are probably true. Everything else, however, we might want to take with a healthy dose of skepticism. And even if Theodora was as bad as Procopius said, the heart wants what it wants, and Justinian still fell madly in love with her. He even had to change an ancient law to be allowed to marry her, which he did back when he was still just Caesar and his uncle was still alive. Procopius framed this event as usurpation, rather than a peaceful transition of power between Justin and Justinian. The historian claimed that the former emperor was doting and utterly senile, the laughingstock of his subjects, and that Justinian and Theodora conspired to gain complete control of the empire, but that no senator or priest dared to say anything against them. However he got the job, Justinian was the new emperor, and as soon as he took the throne, he got to work on his grand ambition to restore the glory of Rome. First things first, he inherited a conflict with the Sasanian Empire, which needed to be sorted. Justinian had to secure his eastern borders before he could make any headway into Western Europe and Northern Africa. He put his best men on the job, a general named Belisarius, widely considered one of the most skilled military commanders in Roman history. And while we're singing his praises, we might as well point out that going forward, Belisarius was the one responsible for many of Byzantium's victories during the reign of Justinian. The empire took a completely hands-off approach when it came to military matters. In fact, he rarely even left Constantinople. This wasn't because he was cowardly or lazy. Quite the opposite, in fact. He was completely swamped with other matters of the empire: politics, construction projects, social and economic policies, and law reform. Justinian became known as the emperor who never sleeps, so it is understandable why he entrusted the sword swinging to Belisarius's capable hands. Although it wasn't quite as sexy on a resume as military glory, Justinian's long-lasting accomplishment was the Corpus Juris Civilis, or simply the Code of Justinian, a complete reform of the Roman Empire's legal frame. They weren't living in ancient times anymore, but some of their laws still dated all the way back to the Roman Republic. Justinian felt that a modern legal system was crucial to improving the functioning of the empire going forward, especially if he was to add the western half back to his kingdom. So the emperor and around 50 of his best scribes, jurists, and other legal experts sat down and went through 2,000 old legal texts to condense them and form a series of new laws which were meant to be more consistent, efficient, and comprehensive. The end result was a new and improved legal code of about 1 million words that was divided into 4 main sections, completed at various times during Justinian's long reign, and was meant to deal with every legal aspect of life in Byzantium. And indeed, it was so thorough that it remained in use in one form or another until the fall of the Byzantine Empire, almost 1,000 years later, and then went on to influence other legal codes throughout Europe. Besides the Code of Justinian, another accomplishment we have to highlight is the famed Hagia Sophia, one of, if not the greatest landmark built during late antiquity. There was already an older basilica on the spot, but it had been badly damaged by fires, so Justinian had it demolished and constructed something much grander in its place, a building that, to this day, remains one of the most impressive and awe-inspiring edifices in the world. This was all part of his master plan. He knew that Rome's arts and culture had spread as far as its armies, if not even wider. So he wanted Byzantium to be not only a military force to be reckoned with, but also the new cultural center of Europe. But as we said, there were quite a few people who stood in his way, so inevitably progress could only be made with sword and shield. In 527 AD, Justinian sent his generals into Caucasus to end the conflict with the Sasanian Empire. But besides the reputation that Belisarius would ultimately gain, he was not at his best in this campaign. The Sasanians, ruled by King Kavad I, were no pushovers. Even though the Byzantine army scored a couple of noteworthy victories at Dara and Saitala, these were not decisive, and they were later pushed back with a defeat at the Battle of Callinicum. This was a real kick in the teeth for Justinian. All of the ambitious plans he had, and he was going to be foiled from the outset? Eventually, he decided that all the time spent fighting the Sasanians was time wasted, so he sought peace between their two empires so he could get back to the things he actually cared about. There was just one problem though. King Kavad wasn't interested in peace once he had the advantage, but occasionally even the greatest of rulers get an assist from Lady Luck. In 531 AD, Kavad fell ill and died, and was succeeded by his son, Khosrow I. But his position as king wasn't quite as secure as his father's, so just like Justinian, he decided that he had more pressing matters to deal with than a war where both sides were evenly matched. So the following year, Khosrow and Justinian signed the Treaty of Eternal Peace. It cost Justinian 11,000 pounds of gold for a so-called eternal peace that lasted less than a decade. Still, it gave the Byzantine emperor the time he needed to reform and strengthen his kingdom according to his vision so that when round 2 came around, he would be better prepared. Justinian's goal of conquering the Mediterranean started with North Africa, which had been taken over by the Vandals, who now occupied most of what used to be Carthage and formed their own thriving kingdom. We don't know if this was always Justinian's intention or if he simply took advantage of the opportunity that presented itself. The previous Vandal king Hilderic had been overthrown in a coup and replaced by Gilimer. Hilderic was on decent terms with the Byzantine Empire, so he wrote to Justinian for help, and the emperor saw this as an invitation to invade. His justification was to help restore his good buddy Hilderic to the throne, except that Gilimer had him executed before the Byzantines even reached Africa, so unless Justinian was the Night King, this was unlikely to happen. But you know, since they traveled all this way, they might as well do a little bit of conquering, right? And to give them credit, they did pretty short work of it too. The Vandalic War lasted less than a year and was basically decided with 2 fights, the Battle of Ad Decimum and the Battle of Tricomerum, both of which ended with a Byzantine victory. The second defeat spelled the end of the Vandal kingdom. Gilimer was carried in chains back to Constantinople, where he was paraded through the streets as Belisarius enjoyed a well-deserved triumph. Meanwhile, the king was added to Justinian's empire and became the Praetorian prefect of Africa. The territory proved easy to take, but not so easy to maintain. Because Justinian was engaged in a full-on conquering spree, he could never leave behind a strong enough contingent of soldiers to keep the peace. The region struggled with mutinies, revolts, and invasions for the next decade and a half, and eventually Belisarius had to make a return trip to put down the rebels permanently. This proved to be a serious problem for Justinian back home as well, as the emperor had to contend with arguably the biggest revolt in Constantinople's history, and one that almost prematurely ended his ambitions of conquest, his reign, and even his life. It was known as the Nika riot, and if you think that modern sports rivalries can get violent, then you ain't seen nothing yet. Back then, chariot racing was the undisputed sport of kings. It was so big in Constantinople that everyone in the city supported one of 4 main factions: the Blues, the Greens, the Reds, or the Whites, although the first 2 were by far the biggest and most influential groups. They were so pervasive in Byzantine society that some historians argued that they were like prototype political parties. Unsurprisingly, the 2 sides fought a lot. After a particularly bloody and lethal melee in January 532, 7 men were arrested in connection to the riot and sentenced to death. The first 5 were executed without incident, but when it came down to the last 2, a blue and a green, the gallows collapsed. The crowd took this as a sign from God that he did not want those men to die. So they rushed to the stage to rescue them and took them to a nearby church. Afterward, they stormed the Hippodrome, and in a foolish attempt to prevent a riot inside the stadium, the authorities shut down the races. Presumably, they believed that without any chariot races to instigate them, the mob would calm down and simply go home. Because that's definitely what happens in situations like this, right? No, of course not. The riots spilled out into the streets, and once they got started, they wanted to burn the whole city down. And so it went day after day. Justinian was holed up in his imperial palace, hoping that the rioters would tire themselves out. But there was no chance of that. They were in full-on rebellion mode. After 5 days of chaos, they even appointed a new would-be emperor, a former consul named Hypatius. Justinian considered fleeing the city, but apparently it was Theodora who convinced him to stay and fight, arguing that death was more honorable than running away. So Justinian and his generals sat down and came up with a plan. Basically, they lured as many of the rioters inside the Hippodrome as possible and then trapped them between 2 armies, slaughtering them without mercy to the very last man. When it was all said and done, approximately 30,000 people had been killed and half of Constantinople was in ruins. Hypatius was swiftly executed and most powerful officials who supported him were exiled. Justinian held onto his power by the skin of his teeth, and now his regularly scheduled programming could resume. In 535 AD, the circumstances were ideal for Justinian to begin the most crucial part of his plan, the conquest of Italy. After all, you can't really restore the Roman Empire without Rome, can you? Things had settled inside his own kingdom, and the peace with the Sasanians was holding, for now. Justinian's newly acquired African prefecture was the perfect launching pad for a military campaign in southern Europe. And to top it all off, Italy was experiencing its own internal power struggle, which gave Justinian a great excuse to interfere. Following the collapse of the Western Roman Empire, the Ostrogoths ruled over Italy and its surroundings. But in 534 AD, King Athalaric died, and a usurper named Theodahad made a play for the throne by having his mother imprisoned and later assassinated. And this was all the motivation Justinian needed. So in 535, his army, commanded once again by Belisarius, set sail for Carthage and landed in Sicily. This was really Belisarius' moment in the sun and the campaign that solidified his reputation as a great military commander. Sicily fell pretty fast and without much resistance, and the following year, he started making his way north toward Rome, while a second Byzantine army invaded and captured the former Roman province of Dalmatia across the Adriatic Sea. Justinian's forces had 3 main targets in mind. Rome, obviously, Mediolanum, the second largest and second richest city in Italy, and Ravenna, the actual capital of the Ostrogothic kingdom. But first up was Neapolis, or Naples as we know it today. The city fell after a 3-week-long siege, and because it had refused to surrender, Belisarius' army sacked it. Hearing what had happened, the citizens of Rome decided they weren't that fond of the Ostrogoths anyway, so in December 536, Belisarius entered Rome unopposed. Meanwhile, the Goths were not too impressed with Theodahad's efforts against Justinian, especially since he never even made an attempt to protect Neapolis. Therefore, the Gothic army elected a general named Witigis as their new ruler, and his first order of business was to have Theodahad executed. Witigis mustered a new army, substantially larger than what Belisarius had, and went to retake Rome. Because the Byzantine forces were severely outmanned, an open battle was out of the question. So Belisarius buckled down for a siege. The siege of Rome, the first of 3 during this prolonged war, lasted over a year but ended in a Roman victory in 538 when reinforcements arrived led by another of Justinian's top generals, Narses. Although this resulted in a short-term victory, over the long run it caused problems because Belisarius and Narses weren't exactly on the same page. Their dissension came to a head in 539 to the detriment of the people of Mediolanum. Like Rome, they accepted the Byzantine Empire without resistance. Remember that that the Ostrogoths had only ruled over Italy for 50 years or so. Many Italians were perfectly fine with the idea of becoming Romans again. However, Witigis had struck an alliance with the Franks, so he traveled with a fresh army to take back Mediolanum. The garrison inside was no match for him, and although Belisarius wanted to send reinforcements, his officers refused to act without orders from Narses. As a result, the Byzantine garrison surrendered, and then the Ostrogoths proceeded to massacre the people of Mediolanum and burn the city as punishment for switching sides. This convinced Justinian to revert his changes. He recalled Narses and sent Belisarius more reinforcements. Now firmly back in charge, Belisarius intended to end the war by capturing Ravenna. He was met with an unexpected proposal: kingship over both the Goths and the Romans. He was the one who did all the hard work, so why shouldn't he be the one to rule instead of Justinian? Surely this would have tempted a lesser man, but Belisarius only feigned interest to get the Goths to surrender. Once Ravenna was in his hands, the general captured Witigis and all his treasures, sent them to Constantinople, and placed them at the feet of his emperor. Even though Justinian had made impressive gains toward his goal of restoring the old empire, they weren't permanent. About a year after losing Ravenna, the Ostrogoths had rallied under the banner of a new king named Totila, and they were ready for a new fight. The second phase of the Gothic War was a protracted affair that went on for almost a decade and a half. Part of the reason why it took so long was that Justinian couldn't spare the resources necessary to end the conflict once and for all. Like the emperors he wanted to emulate, he was finding out the hard way the difficulties of maintaining a large empire. The eternal peace between Byzantium and the Sasanian Empire turned out to be not so eternal, so in 540 King Khosrow invaded Roman territory and claimed dominion over the region of Lazica. Like the second phase of the Gothic War, the renewed hostilities between these two powers turned into a prolonged conflict that ended up dominating the second half of Justinian's almost 40-year-long reign. Byzantium was dealing with wars on its eastern and western fronts, and yet something else represented an even bigger problem: the Plague of Justinian. This pandemic represented the first major outbreak of bubonic plague in history and wreaked havoc on the Byzantine Empire. Although its origins are still uncertain, the pestilence arrived in Constantinople around 542, killing around a fifth of the city's population. Even Justinian himself fell ill with the disease, although he got better.
Here, he says he's not dead.
Yes, he is. I'm not.
He isn't?
Well, he will be soon. He's very ill. I'm getting better.
The true impact that the plague had on Justinian's reign is up for debate, but there's no denying that it crippled his empire, depriving it of soldiers, workers, and taxes at a time when he needed them the most. The Byzantine forces kept fighting, Belisarius in the east and Narses in the west, but at best, they resulted in Pyrrhic victories. They gave Justinian a taste of the old glory days, but if anything, made it abundantly clear that the majesty, renown, and dominance of the once mighty Roman Empire were gone forever, and would remain confined to the history books. Justinian died in November 565 at the age of 83. He didn't have an heir, so he was succeeded by his nephew, Justin II. It's true that the Byzantine Empire reached its greatest extent under Justinian, but most of those territories, particularly in Italy, were lost in the decades that followed his death. Ultimately, although Justinian's ambition was to greatly expand his empire, his true legacy was found inside the kingdom he started with, that of a prolific builder, a successful administrator, and a legal reformer. I hope you learned something today, and if you enjoyed today's video, be sure to deploy your likes, comment your favorite king from ancient history, subscribe to the channel if you're not, and share this video with someone who loves learning about history and the people who made it memorable. I'm Eric Malachite, and I'll see you next time, Space Cowboy.